Moving along in the program, we will next hear from Steve, also a member of the PSO. So please welcome Comrade Steve.
Thank you so much, Comrade Sam, for the introduction. Good evening, comrades and friends. Thank you very much for coming to our forum. In one of the debates with then President Donald Trump, presidential candidate Joe Biden said that anyone responsible for 220,000 deaths from COVID should not remain as president. Well, Joe, 4 times that amount have died during your tenure as president. For God's sake, this man cannot be allowed to remain in power. Biden said that about Russian President Vladimir Putin, but to what extent should the finger be pointed back in his direction? We are going to pull on that thread today. COVID is a viral illness that continues to run rampant around the world. The worst part about this, it could very well have been over already if we would have implemented some common sense disease control policies and kept them in place rather than rolling them back at the first opportunity. This presentation focuses on the US COVID response or lack thereof over the past 2.5 years. I will begin by providing a somewhat chronological summary of the US's COVID response, then follow that up by presenting some descriptive statistics that attempt to situate the US within the context of the rest of the world. Sure, things were bad, but have we in the United States really fared that much worse than other countries on average? We'll investigate. Finally, I will discuss potential solutions and next steps. Before I begin, I need to let you know that I am not a virologist, epidemiologist, or physician, and the following content should not be construed as medical advice. That being said, I am a scientist and I know how to use Microsoft Excel to make charts using spreadsheets. So on to the rest of the prepared remarks. This pandemic has been so life-altering for people in the US for so long that it's getting harder to even remember what life was like before all of this started. As they say, hindsight is 2020, so it feels somewhat unfair to reach back into what feels like ancient history to criticize every misstep on the part of federal, state, and local government, as well as administration officials and elected representatives. But even back then, there was and continues to be pushback against the government's approaches to managing the pandemic from various voices representing a variety of different political viewpoints. So to the extent these issues were raised at the time, I think it is appropriate to acknowledge when officials were told of the consequences, but chose to move forward anyway with approaches that were, in review, more harmful to human health on balance than beneficial. When the WHO declared the coronavirus a global pandemic on March 11, 2020, I think it's fair to say that many, if not most, people around the world experienced unprecedented disruptions to their daily lives. Here in the US, shortly after the pandemic was declared, we experienced several disruptions. For instance, it was nearly impossible to find staple goods that were previously abundant. Many items were either out of stock or in such short supply that quantity restrictions had to be employed. Products such as meat, toilet paper, high quality face masks such as N95s and KN95s. With the announcement of various stay-at-home orders, many businesses were declared non-essential and were subject to closure or restrictions. Therefore, they began laying people off and furloughing them en masse. Millions of people, tens of millions, found themselves suddenly without a job to go to and no way to pay the rent, groceries, and other essentials. When it comes to the federal government's initial reaction, there's a few moving pieces we'll need to cover. First, let's again recall that this was what would turn out to be the final year of Donald Trump's presidency. Shortly after the declaration of the pandemic, Trump announces a 15 days to slow the spread policy. States and local governments issue stay-at-home orders, as mentioned, to try to limit gatherings and therefore the spread of the virus. When it comes to these common sense social distancing and quarantine protocols, this ignited a rash of right-wing reaction, which I'll cover in much more detail shortly. Suffice to say, law enforcement, never more than a few steps away from the forces of reaction, announced their opposition to and defiance of these public health protocols and went out of their way to announce that they wouldn't be enforcing the stay-at-home orders, which severely undermine what would have been and should have been a unified and orderly response to a viral pandemic. Of course, they did selectively enforce the stay-at-home orders on people of color, using it as a pretext to break up their social gatherings. Meanwhile, top officials were still urging Americans not to wear masks, despite knowing full well that they would be effective in a cynical effort, ostensibly, to ensure adequate supply for the healthcare providers. After significant consternation, infectious disease experts eventually recommended the use of masks, but only required it while riding public transit and at the airport or on an airplane. They also did not put into place testing requirements for for domestic travel as they did for international. In spite of that, you had healthcare workers going to battle with the novel coronavirus armed with inadequate or sometimes makeshift supplies of PPE or personal protective equipment. There were these famous photos of the healthcare workers in the hospital with gowns made of what appeared to be trash bags. Healthcare workers were told to reuse their masks over and over. When it came to identifying community spread through contact tracing and testing, that was another huge ball drop. First, when it came to testing, initially the CDC's own test was ineffective, and it took a tremendously long time to build testing capacity. There was no nationwide effort to stand up contract tracing to speak of really whatsoever. That effort was left up to states and locals who were, upon review, not particularly effective at controlling community spread. And other policy responses to attempt to stabilize the economy included most notably the CARES Act. So of the $4 trillion in COVID relief, $2.3 trillion went to bail out businesses who were, in many cases, not required to demonstrate that they kept employees on the payroll. Nearly 75% of the PPP loans, or Paycheck Protection Program loans, didn't go to paying employee wages, according to a newly released Fed report. As a side note, these corporate bailouts, not the direct payments to individuals, are one of the drivers of inflation we're experiencing now. Only about a fifth of it went to individuals and families. People making under certain incomes were eligible for a couple rounds of stimulus checks. $600 stimulus checks were given out as a sort of wage replacement, even though it's not possible to make that amount of money last several months. So-called enhanced unemployment assistance was available, but many were not able to navigate the process because of the flood of people applying, and it often took a long time to be approved for benefits. And even then, folks were still having a hard time because of how little money was coming in through unemployment. The CDC instituted an eviction moratorium, but unless I'm mistaken, it was one of those things where you had to specifically declare to your landlord that your non-payment of rent was a direct result of losing your job due to the pandemic, and you could still be evicted for other things. And it obviously didn't stop informal evictions, which, as advocates point out, may constitute a substantial portion of all actual evictions. And it didn't stop the rent from continuing to accrue. Some places like Sacramento had rental assistance to help with that, but again, it wasn't something that was just given to you. Rather, you had to navigate through a labyrinthian bureaucratic maze, and even then, it was subject to funding availability and income thresholds. All the while, essential workers were told to keep coming into work in spite of inadequate health and safety measures, usually with no additional pay. Additionally, Trump used a provision known as Title 42 to exclude refugees seeking asylum in the United States due to the pandemic, an act that contravenes international law for jingoistic purposes. Now, as I previously alluded to, the pandemic whipped up the forces of reaction. And along with the forces of capital, from the outset, they saw the pandemic as getting in the way of their liberties and their businesses, and that it was either a hoax or something that was deliberately done to us by China. And so there was this sense from the very beginning that as much as the corporations and the media ran feel-good advertisements and stories about how we were all in this together, that there were these two classes of people: those who got to stay home, stay socially distanced, and ride it out in luxury. And the other hand, those who had to go to work to keep the economy running and expose themselves to the pandemic. And there was this sense that those in power, as well as the lackeys and the lapdogs of capital, were willing to tell other people to die for the economy. To me, that's really what the pandemic exposed most of all, is the fealty of some to an economic system, capitalism, that keeps them subservient, and their insistence that this is rational and that other people should adopt the same outlook and also be willing to die for the sake of the economy. Now, Trump was duplicitous to say the least when it came to messaging on COVID. Trump initially wanted to go on TV as much as possible, as Governors Andrew Cuomo of New York and Gavin Newsom of California were doing at the time, and talk about how wonderful everything was going. But he kept getting asked difficult questions and making a fool out of himself, like insisting that it would go away like a miracle, and wondering out loud if people should inject/drink bleach or use UV light subcutaneously or something to that effect. But then someone realized that this wasn't really helping his poll numbers, and so he put Mike Pence up there, and eventually they just kind of stopped doing it altogether. Now, Trump seemed to, at every opportunity, appeal to the anti-maskers and the COVID deniers. He tweeted that states with common sense COVID protocols in place needed to be, quote unquote, liberated. He held an infamous indoor rally in Tulsa on June 20th, 2020, that was largely composed of maskless individuals. This was a super spreader event that led to the death of his fellow Republican businessman, the late pizza mogul Herman Cain. At this rally, he referred to the coronavirus using a racially tinged slang term connoting Chinese people were responsible for spreading the coronavirus, which helped fuel a surge of anti-Asian hate and violence that continues to be an ever-present concern among Asian people living in the US. He also recalled to the delight of audience goers that he had asked public health officials to slow down the testing, although White House press staff later attempted to clarify, do damage control, that this was said in jest. Although I, for one, fail to see the humor in it, even after having watched the clip, several times. There was even a piece, and I won't go into this too much, in Vanity Fair, citing unnamed officials who said that Trump chose not to undertake a strong federal response because it was believed that the pandemic would largely affect blue or Democratic states, and that they could then blame the governors of those states as a kind of political cover. So when it came to the development of vaccines, billions of dollars in public funds were expended to bankroll an entire suite of potential vaccines to, it was thought, put an end to the pandemic. However, there was, as was expected, an immense shortage of vaccines to begin with, and the vaccine rollout was much slower than everyone would have liked, and it was plagued with plenty of issues that I don't have time to discuss here. Suffice to say, because these vaccines continue to be in private hands and because they insist that there be a cost associated with it, this ensures that there will be inequalities and disparities in terms of access and availability. By allowing the vaccine to be kept in private hands, even though they were largely developed using subsidized R&D and with the help of taxpayer dollars, the US is ensuring that the virus will be with us for years to come, so the drug industry can profit off of sickness and disease. When the vaccines finally did come out early last year, it seemed at first like everything was going to be fine and that we would be getting on with our lives. Again, at the first opportunity, restrictions were lifted and people were actually encouraged to go maskless in public and indoors if they were vaccinated. Then the Delta and the Omicron variants hit us like a ton of bricks and stressed our healthcare system tremendously yet again. With so many people out of work due to illness and a short supply of rapid tests, Dr. Rochelle Walensky of the CDC said that people with COVID only need to isolate for 5 days and don't need to test negative before returning to work, essentially telling people to basically just chance it and risk infecting people because we got to keep the economy running. So, as I have laid out, we had a series of half measures that were kind of hastily and shoddily put into place with very little in terms of federal coordination and response, and the onus really being on state and local government to try to fill in these huge gaps and plug the very large holes in terms of service delivery. Even then, one by one, these half measures were rolled back. We witnessed in horror as the federal vaccine mandate was declared dead, with the courts having found that OSHA overstepped its authority to regulate workplace safety when it comes to the coronavirus, as the federal mask mandate for public transit and airlines was no longer a thing, and as mask mandates turned into watered down recommendations. Now we find ourselves in the grip of BA 2.12.1, BA 4, and BA 5. And the government has basically decided to let it rip and have the virus essentially do its thing and ravage our society. We're in a place where it's at best uncertain whether the vaccines for the alpha variant even work very effectively on the new variants and subvariants. And incredibly, in spite of all of that, comrades, they are urging us to get back to work and get back to living our lives as normal. People act like it isn't such a big deal nowadays, but it's still killing 300 people per day in this country and sickening 100,000 per day. And according to one recent report, the chances of getting what's known as long COVID could be as high as 1 in 2. I, for one, am not down to catch a potentially lifelong illness that wreaks havoc on multiple organ systems in the body just so my boss can feel chuffed about having a little FaceTime with his underlings. Biden hasn't been much better than his predecessor on COVID. He's just been less offensive in some respects. Not only, as I alluded to at the beginning, has he been responsible for far more deaths than his predecessor, now they have embraced deliberately a strategy that can only be described as sitting back and watching as people get infected and then attempting to treat them when they do become ill to the benefit of the pharmaceutical corporations. Now we will quickly explore 3 relevant charts I pulled together to reinforce and extend on some of the points I made. My first chart shows that despite being roughly 4% of the world's population, the US has been responsible for 12 to 24% of cases each year of the pandemic. Not to be glib, but we really punch above our weight when it comes to our outsized impact on cases. Almost as important to point out is that there have been almost as many COVID cases year to date as there have been during the entirety of 2020 and 2021 combined. How dare the corporate powers that be force us back into the office when this is still happening with such frequency? It's almost like They want us to be just healthy enough to be able to barely make it into the office and sick enough not to be able to meaningfully fight back against the constant streams of bullshit coming down the pike. My second chart shows that the US has been responsible for as many as 48% of all new cases worldwide in a single day. There have been 9 days where the US made up more than 40% of all new cases worldwide. And finally, the last chart shows total vaccine doses given per 1 million people. As you can see, the US is just barely better than average, and Vietnam has pulled ahead of us in terms of vaccine administration over 7 months or so ago. Wrapping up here, I'll just provide a few things that if we had a socialist society, we would have been able to do to get the pandemic under control, and what we could do still even now. And some of these recommendations aren't even socialist. Other somewhat less neoliberal countries have done some form of these policies as well. And with $4 trillion at our disposal, the sky's the limit in terms of cost. Instead of handing out money to big corporations, rich people, and Wall Street, here's what we could do instead. So I'll just run through it briefly here. 1, cancel all the rents and mortgages for the duration of the pandemic. 2, deliver nutritious meals and clean drinking water to all households free of charge. 3, pour billions of dollars into a moonshot initiative for the development of a pan-coronavirus vaccine. 4, produce and deliver billions of doses to other countries free of charge. 5, provide free testing and treatment to everyone and free transportation to and from these sites. 6, provide housing for those who need to quarantine after exposure to or infection with COVID. 7, require vaccinations for workplaces. 8, develop and roll out Omicron-specific boosters to all as soon as possible. 9, invest billions of dollars into long COVID research and treatment. And finally, 10, encourage work from home to the maximum extent feasible. It saves gas and prevents unneeded community transmission of viral illnesses. In order to enact these policies and put the pandemic behind us once and for all, we need to fundamentally transform our society into a socialist society. And to do that, the best way is to join a revolutionary socialist party like the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I encourage you to take that first step today by applying on our website at pslweb.org/join. Comrades and friends, if enough of us band together to make it happen, we can achieve these gains and much, much more. Please take that first step today. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll turn it back to Comrade Sam.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, for that insightful talk. Now we're moving into our second discussion session. For the sake of time, we'll be keeping our discussion at 10 minutes so we can give some proper time for our guest speaker. So a reminder, please either raise your hand or type stack in the message chat and I will call on you. So we'd ask that you please introduce yourself and also limit comments or questions to 2 minutes to give other chance to speak. So are there any questions or comments? So I'll give it about a minute or two for any questions or comments before we move on. So I have a question from a direct message, actually. The question is there a comparison of Trump and Biden's response to COVID? Great question. Would any of the comments want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, it's multifaceted, I think, as I pointed out. it's and I think the response has shifted, from last year to this year, and it's particularly now, as I mentioned, having abandoned or having kind of let go without much of a fight many of these previous protocols like the mask mandate for air travel and so on, and the vaccine requirements and so forth. Yeah, and then absent congressional approval for more funding, it really seems like we're in a pretty dark place right now, right? I mean, they are not calling COVID press conferences or trotting people out talking about getting boosted and so on, and it really seems like the entire effort to kind of mitigate and the spread has all but collapsed, and they've really shifted to this treatment approach where there's a lot more money to be made, of course, in the treatment, in the administration of these antiviral drugs and experimental cocktails and the Paxlovid and so on. So you can bet that this is profitable for the insurance industry, the drug industry, the hospitals, to some extent, healthcare companies, people who do medical billing and so on. So yeah, I mean, I think there was kind of it's hard to say. I mean, as I mentioned, Trump was pretty duplicitous. I think he genuinely would have preferred the coronavirus to go away, obviously, because that wouldn't have been hanging out in the air. But at the same time, he used it as a political tool to whip up his reactionary base, as I mentioned, the COVID deniers and the anti-mask so-called freedom convoys and all of that. So I would say I don't want to take too much time, but it's a bit of a mixed bag, right now. And arguably Biden, with so many deaths on his hands, you can make the case that, on balance, the response is worse.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I'll be calling on Cosmo and then Robert, and then after that, we'll be moving on to our guest speaker. So Cosmo, feel free to unmute.
Hi, thank you. One of the things that I did notice, at least in my own experiences with the pandemic, I spent most of this in my early years of my doctoral program at my local university in my hometown. And one of the things that caught me kind of off guard in the last couple of months was trying to get the fourth booster vaccine. Now, I don't know how many of people in the audience have been able to reach it, but for the way I got it immediately after sort of a soft eviction process. I don't want to go into that. So I went into the university to get it after my moving was done. And when I went to the counter, I was nearly turned away from being able to get my second, my fourth shot. And what they told me is that I had to be over 55 or have a pre-existing condition. As it turned out, I did have a chronic asthma condition that was documented in my medical records. And so they were willing to let me pass. But it got me immediately thinking, there were problems, and this is back in May. And so this was just 2 months after the fourth booster shots were being made available to the public. And they were still being restricted to people over the age of 50 and those with pre-existing conditions that were particularly susceptible to COVID. And I guess my question now is that, like, for how many other places in the country is that like right now? And yeah, has that situation changed since May? Because clearly the US is moving towards a position of treating the COVID, obviously COVID as a for-profit disease treatment, as is clear and evident by the increasing difficulty of finding free COVID testing. I'm able to get it still at the university, but basically everyone else in the general public seems to be just crap out of luck right now.
Excellent points. Yeah, I'll take that. Yeah, I think two things. Yeah, for now, there's still the rapid testing for that you can get through the postal service, or it's distributed by the postal service. But yeah, as far as PCR testing for free and that sort of thing, as I mentioned, the federal funding, they've irresponsibly let it kind of lapse or expire, and I think there's talk of, since the funds haven't been appropriated, they've had to take them from elsewhere, and so eventually they will run out of funds for free vaccines and free testing, I think, for people that's government supported. And then as far as fourth booster, yeah, I think that's still the case. They're not recommending even still a fourth booster for the general public here.
Has
Yeah,
there ever
but
been? Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but has
that's
there
all
ever
right.
been an explanation as to why that was the case? Because my parents have been wondering that for themselves.
Right. Yeah, my mother, cares for my father, who's immunocompromised, and so initially, I think it was just for folks who were had pre-existing condition. So yeah, and so I think I can relate to some of those challenges there. It doesn't make sense if the caregiver is not boosted, and then they go out to the store, potentially like bring it back to the immunocompromised person. So yeah, making sure that the people who need it can get it, I think is a high priority. I won't comment on, I think, whether or not it's needed. Not a virologist, but I think that the official line from the government is that they're sort of still evaluating the efficacy of the fourth booster for the general public. And then Pfizer and Moderna are developing supposedly some kind of Omicron specific booster that may be deployed for, again, like certain categories of high risk people come this fall. But there's so many moving pieces that it's hard to say. I hope that helps a little bit.
It doesn't, but it does and it doesn't. I'll phrase it like that. I'll cede the floor to Robert since he's been waiting patiently.
Yeah, feel free to unmute Robert. And
Hey, can everybody hear me?
yes.
Okay. I just wanted to point out the comments that I had sent in the chat. The implications of something like this in the whole United States is dreadful. COVID relief was given to many states, many counties, many cities, but yet it ended up in the hands of the police departments. It ended up in the hands of different levels of bourgeois and petty bourgeois development, in a lot of different areas. Like I had mentioned in the comments as well, what are the implications of this? What's happening in the smaller cities that are not publicized? This is just a farce. This is just the bourgeois openly and with the total disregard for human life. This is just sickening. And in my personal experience as well, like I've had family members who unfortunately had passed. It's tough, and it's disgraceful that the United States federal government is doing nothing to prevent these things from continuing to happen. And they are obviously more concerned with fattening their pockets and things of that nature.
Yeah, as I think the best answer for me would be to kind of reference Parenti, in the sense that it's only disgraceful, it's only morally bankrupt, it's only morally reprehensible from a human perspective. From a bourgeois capitalist perspective, this unprecedented wealth transfer is wonderful. It's something that they welcome and relish and have been looking to receive, I think, because of that, how they're laid out, the class dynamics. And so I think, yeah, the point is to kind of we haven't centered the human perspective in this conversation. It's this notion that the economy here is so much more important than human life, and that human life can be sacrificed for the well-being of the economy. Yeah, I mean, it shows it is completely morally bankrupt from a human perspective. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for the discussion, everyone.